question. My question is that I wish to know the purpose of certain areas of my life. I'm quite lost as to what to do with my parents in this embodiment. They have been quite hostile and dysfunctional in their marriage, but they have raised me as immigrants in the Western world, and I do feel like I owe them some allegiance for that. However, they are quite a drain on my energy and mental stability. They, I sense, have also lost connection to a higher purpose in their lives. Their marriage exists in a stalemate, and all others around them only deteriorate and stagnate. What might be the purpose of such a marriage? I don't quite understand this commitment towards something that has no meaning. Yet they have no cares about my life, supporting me emotionally in any way. I talk to random people in my life like friends who I find more supportive, even though we have no blood bonds and have only met recently. I do feel a sense of shame and insecurity around not having a family support system, and I wonder what will happen. I have now moved to the US, and I think I will probably spend a long time of my life here. I have no communication or connection with my parents, and I'm struggling with this. Please help me shed a light on the situation. Well, the first thing I would say here is that I've talked to people from other cultures than my own. As I said, I grew up in Denmark. I've talked to people from South America. I've talked to people from Asia who grew up in a culture where the bonds to family is much stronger. I think it's also that way in the Middle East, even though I haven't personally talked to anybody from there. So what you have is, when you look at the world, you see that there are certain cultures where they have this very, very strong projection of the importance of family and the bond to the family, and as it says there, the blood bond. You are bound by blood. Okay, and this is something that it has some ramifications here, but let's just talk at a fairly simple level. As I said, I grew up in Denmark where we don't have the strong family bond. We certainly don't have this projection, you're bound by blood. But of course, we also have families in Denmark. I have a family in Denmark that they all know each other, they all live together in the same town. I was the only one who really moved away from my hometown. And so there are still some bonds there. But here's how I would look at this, okay? I have talked about it before, that we who are spiritual people, and if you're not a spiritual person, why would you ask me this question? We have to first of all be loyal to our personal growth. I know some will call this egotistical, narcissistic, and whatever. But the fact of the matter is that we as spiritual people, we have to, our primary concern in this lifetime is our spiritual growth. And that means that we have to reevaluate the culture we grew up in and say, have we had programmed into our subconscious minds, have we been brainwashed with this need to be loyal to family no matter what? Because what you see in some spiritual people is that they have been programmed with this loyalty to family, and there comes a point where it is conflicting with their spiritual growth. In other words, they have to take a step in order to have maximum spiritual growth, but their family is opposing it directly or pulling them away from it. And it's, as I've talked about before we come into embodiment, we make a life plan. And that life plan has certain steps and stages we have to go through in order to have maximum growth, and in order to, well, on the one side resolve the psychology we have, and on the other hand give the gift we're here to give in this lifetime. And so that often means that we have to make certain outer changes in our lives that are beyond what our family would do. Now the question here mentions that he or she, the parents took them to the Western world, but now the person has moved to the United States and is not in contact with the parents. So these are the just some of the decisions. But the other decision can be you become a spiritual person, you join a spiritual movement. I've seen many people who, when they joined the spiritual movement, their parents opposed it, or at least they didn't approve of it whatsoever. And so what I'm saying is, when you're a spiritual person, you have to tune into your life plan, and you have to follow that life plan, even if your parents and your family can't see it, can't see the purpose of it, and don't want you to do it. They want to pull you away from it. There comes a point where you have to decide, no, I'm first of all loyal to my inner plan. I'm not saying you have to be hostile towards your family, but you just have to tune in intuitively, a sense, what is your divine plan, your life plan, and then decide to follow that. Now, in terms of the question is asking about what's the purpose of a marriage like the parents are having, where they're hostile, they're dysfunctional, well, there isn't really any purpose to this. I mean, what you often see is that, as I've said before, as a spiritual person, there can be times where you're choosing a certain family because there's something you can learn from it. For example, they're acting out a certain tendency in an extreme way, so you can see it in your own psychology, either that you have the same tendency or that you are reacting to it, so that you can move on. But there are also sometimes as spiritual persons, we just have to come into embodiment. And this happens to be here as a family where we can come into embodiment. That works somewhat with our divine plan. So there are many cases where, as a spiritual person, you have to look at your family background and say, okay, what is the dysfunctional aspects of it? And what do I need to learn from it? Do I have the same tendency in my psychology? For example, I want to control other people. Or do I actually have to learn to not let myself be controlled because I draw boundaries and say no? These are just two examples. There could be many others, of course. So this is one thing. But there can also come a point where you say, okay, I have a life plan. I had to come into embodiment somehow. That meant I had a certain family I grew up in. But now it's time to move on. I have moved to another country. I don't have contact with my parents. There's nothing I can do to help them with their marriage. So I have to move on. I simply have to move on in my mind, cut the ties in my mind. So I'm not pulled by this feeling shame and insecurity around not having a family support system, feeling you have to be loyal to the family. This is what is instilled in many of these cultures. And so, so again, with the dysfunctional marriage, what is the purpose of a dysfunctional marriage? Well, you could say if there is a purpose, it is that people act out their dysfunctional psychology to such an extreme that they or the people around them finally have had enough of it. That people get fed up with it and say, I don't want to live my life this way. And you see this, I've seen this in marriages. My grandparents on my mother's side, they were married for over 40 years. But they were bickering at each other. They weren't really having big arguments, but they were bickering at each other every single day. I mean, I still remember my grandmother would look after me when I was a child and before I started school, and my grandfather would come home from work and he'd barely gotten in the door before they were bickering about something. Why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done that? Blah, blah, blah. It just went on and on and on. And I remember he was a child thinking, gosh, I can't live this way. I don't want to live this way. So, so what you have is in many of these cultures where they have the loyalty to family, of course, divorce is unthinkable. So the people can't say, okay, our marriage has fulfilled its purpose. We raise children. Let's split up and go our separate directions. So they have to stay together and they just keep going on with their dysfunction. And it may be that they never get out of it in this lifetime. That happens to a lot of people, especially in a certain generation. Especially because it's unthinkable you can get divorced. But then at least people around them can look at this and say, I don't want to repeat these kind of dysfunctional patterns. I've had enough of this. The only purpose of some of these things that people do to each other is to become so extreme that people finally decide enough of this. So you have a right to decide, enough of this, enough of what my parents did. I don't want to be tied to them psychologically. And therefore you can use the tools that I talked about with the subconscious self, because what makes you feel insecurity and shame? Because you have some subconscious selves that were programmed into you possibly over many lifetimes, certainly in this lifetime. And you need to look at those selves and dismiss them. Say, I don't want you in my life anymore. I don't want my life to be affected by this. You have a right to move on. Obviously, it seems like the parents don't want to move on. They don't care about you. They're trapped in their own patterns. So you have a right to say, well, I'm moving on. I can't let them hold me back. There's also, if you think about it, a deeper meaning. You know, and I'm especially thinking about it that the person says, I can often talk better to friends that I've just met. They are more supportive, even though we have no blood bond. See, the blood bond is also very strong in these cultures. And if you look at this symbolically, you can talk about in Christianity, you have the concept of the spilling of Jesus' blood on the cross, which supposedly paid for our sins. But the deeper symbolic meaning here is that the blood of Christ is not physical blood. It's the consciousness of Christ, the Christ consciousness, what I call the one mind. So, in other words, when you're a spiritual person, how do you grow? By seeking greater and greater connection to and oneness with the one mind, the Christ mind. That is the blood of Christ, meaning the consciousness of Christ. But this is beyond the physical blood. This fascination that some Christians have with the physical blood of Jesus is just an illusion. It's a misinterpretation of it that I won't go into here. But the idea is that you can say the physical blood, this is of this world. This is the world of separation. And the blood bond you have to family is of this world. But the real bond you have is to your higher self, to your spiritual teachers, and to what we might call your spiritual family. And that is not a physical blood bond, it's the blood of Christ, in other words, the consciousness of oneness. So what actually happens to a lot of spiritual people is that when we make that commitment to the spiritual path, when we switch over to really, saying, I leave my past behind, I'm focused on the spiritual path, we will meet people that are our spiritual family. And this can be because we've been connected with them in past lives. And so we feel a stronger bond to them, even though we don't have a physical blood bond, we have a spiritual blood bond through the one mind. But oftentimes we can't necessarily find these people or recognize them as long as we are so tied to the physical family. And I'm not thereby saying, because again, everything has to be balanced and the ego will try to use anything. I'm not thereby saying that as a spiritual person you should leave your family behind. It's not really a matter of physically necessarily cutting off. But if you came from a dysfunctional family, it may be necessary for you to cut the tie for a time so you can free yourself from this pull on you. But I'm just not saying that you have to leave your family, because of course there have been many instances where spiritual people, even in some cults where they encourage people to leave their family behind, so they have no ties to anything outside the cult, so they can control people. There have been some tragic examples of people who have left their family behind and it wasn't really the right thing to do. So I'm just trying to say here that you need to go within and intuitively sense. But what you can always do is you can psychologically cut your ties to your family by looking at your own psychology and what makes you feel that you should be loyal to these people. See, what you also see in the question here is that the person has difficulty dealing with the parents. And I'm not saying it's easy because they obviously are dysfunctional, but Why do you have difficulty dealing with your parents? Because of unresolved psychology in you. True, the parents have unresolved psychology, but that's not what makes it difficult for you. What makes it difficult for you to deal with their unresolved psychology is your own unresolved psychology. So if you make an effort to use the tools and teachings the masters are given, and also whatever psychological tools are available out there that appeal to you, you can overcome the psychology in yourself. And ideally, you should come to a point where you can deal with your blood family without having any problems with it. They can't control you. They can't influence you beyond what you allow, but you can still have a cordial relationship with them. And so, again, as I know I always say this, it's all about resolving your own psychology to deal with situations like this. And this is possibly why you chose to be born in that family, to resolve some psychology. So it's a matter of really making an effort to look at that and deal with it. So please help me shed some light on the situation. I hope I've done that instead of confusing you even more.